Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you, Chairman Moon, and all of your colleagues on the Global Peace Foundation. It's a very great honor for me to be back with all of you again this year. And it's an honor for me to be back in Philippines, which I first visited more than 40 years ago. Before I offer some thoughts, I would rise to a point of personal privilege, however, and point out that I am here today as an interested individual, as one who, like all of you, is an advocate for world peace, for global peace. I've also had some, shall we say, political involvement over the last months in the United States. I was an early supporter of one of the candidates for President of the United States when it was not very popular to have supported him. I went on, at his invitation, became a senior policy advisor to President-elect Trump, and I am a continuing supporter of him. But I want to advocate and announce that I am here today speaking completely as an individual and not on behalf of the new administration. We can get into that perhaps in discussions over the course of the next several days. Jim, you're quite right. I have long been involved in and interested in American policy toward Asia. Not quite since the first disruptor president of the United States became involved in policy of Asia. That was Andrew Jackson in 1833, under whom the Treaty of Amity and Commerce between the United States and the Kingdom of Siam was first announced, and when the two sides agreed on commercial relations, quote, as long as heaven and earth shall endure. That's quite a while for trade relations between the United States and Thailand, but it does indicate that our relationship and our interest in Asia from the United States does go on for a very long time. All of you know the United States involvement. You know the sacrifices that we have made in this country specifically, in Korea, and throughout all of Asia, over the years, over the decades. You also know that policy in Washington can be a very messy and a very noisy process. And it's been particularly noisy over the last few months. But under it all, in the people of the United States, there is an underlying support for liberty and for hoping that others can also embrace individual liberty and advancing both economically and socially for them and for successor generations. Many millions of Asians who have lived under tyranny in past generations have, in fact, been able to have a better life, to now live in democratic societies because of the involvement of the United States. And for that, all of us in the United States are very proud and, I think, very pleased that we have been able to play this kind of a role because we are all one. The stakes involved in recognizing America's status in the Pacific have never been greater. Asia is home to the world's largest, fastest growing economies. When we established at the Heritage Foundation our Asian Studies Center some 30 plus years ago, I remember telling the White House, the Washington press conferences, that someday we could even anticipate when U.S. trade with Asia would be more than it is with Europe. Of course, today it's 3 times greater with Asia than it is with Europe. Asia is also a place where America's interests are profoundly challenged day by day, month by month. There are specific situations which I will discuss very briefly in a moment, in which we will discuss in more detail over the course of the next several days. But America, in a very big way, has been, because of its involvement with Asia, creating jobs and economic opportunity No, not just here in Asia, but also for my countrymen back in the United States. More and more Asians are immigrating to the United States to improve their own futures, and they in turn improve America's future. Alas, there's also a dark side. Historical tensions in the region threaten to boil over. Borders that have been floating, shall we say, for decades, but those that remain in dispute or are newly disputed become major flashpoints. The roots of democracy are not yet very deep in all of the countries of Asia. There are alternative models of governance, and there are nightmare regimes still extant here in the region. There is also competition for the liberal vision that America has fashioned and challenges to the predominant American military might that has guaranteed that vision. History has taught us that without active leadership from the United States, this volatile mix has a way of eventually drawing America into internal Asian situations. I think the 20th century proved that time and time again. There is tremendous upside to the shift in global power and wealth to the Pacific, which we, in a friendly fashion, call America's Near West, not the Far East. For the sake of our own nation, we need to understand and grasp the opportunity that expanded relations with Asia provide. I think there have been signals already from the new administration of the importance of Asia. The very first trip by the very first cabinet member confirmed by the United States Senate, Secretary of Defense Mattis, was not to Europe, it was in fact to Asia. We also need to make the strategic investments and commitments necessary to guard against external risks. The upside will not accrue to the U.S. without deep positive involvement in the life of the region, and the downside will not be managed without our presence. It is time to take a new view of Asia, fully cognizant of all that is at stake in our continuing effort to carry the responsibility of shared leadership in the region. If I may, let me talk briefly about the Us Philippine relationship. As all of you know, it is a very long one. Early on, it was a difficult and challenging one that, frankly, we should not be completely proud of. They are, the United States and the Republic of Philippines, are signatories to a security treaty that dates back in its predecessor versions more than 60 years, and that President Duterte says he has no interest in overturning. For that, I think both the Philippine people and the people of the United States should be pleased and grateful. U.S. Armed Forces enjoy access to Philippine facilities under a 1999 Visiting Forces Agreement, and in 2014, the two nations signed an agreement to expand that access. The United States is thus the Philippines' security partner, as well as its principal foreign arms supplier. Now, this summary doesn't even begin to touch on our shared history and people-to-people ties in so many other areas, in terms of culture, in terms of economics, in terms of the rule of law, in terms of education. And as others have said before, to visit Manila, to visit anywhere in the Philippines, is to come face to face with the most incredible asset that exists in the world, and that is the incredible asset of human capital. The human capital of the Philippine people is truly marvelous. So we have so much that we can learn from each other, that we can do together, and this is so much a good time to be able to be together to reaffirm those positive relationships. With regard to a theme that has undergird these conferences since the very beginning, let me discuss very briefly, if I may, the Korean situation. So much has happened since we were last together, ranging from positive developments in the security arena, the agreement by both of our countries that a theater missile defense system should be deployed in Korea. So much has occurred that perhaps has confused people on both sides in terms of political changes, both in Korea and in the United States, some of which are still being confirmed or being developed even as we meet here. And yet, again, when I look at the two people, the people of Korea and the people of the United States, I see so much that's in common. Every Korean I know remains saddened by the division of the Korean people into North and South at the 38th parallel, a subject that we will be discussing in much greater detail over the course of this conference. The Korean people still, and I know this from my frequent trips to Korea, still dream of reunification, even as they tell me about their appreciation for the sacrifices of their friends, the Americans, not just during the Korean War in the early 1950s, but over the decades. When we talk about the situation north of the demilitarized zone, it's with continuing concern. United Nations Security Council resolutions that have repeatedly condemned the DPRK, North Korea, for its nuclear activities. United Nations independent reports on the incredible human suffering, the human rights violations perpetrated by the government of the DPRK. But somehow the people of South Korea and of the United States, I think, increasingly understand that this brings us together in terms of wanting to do something concretely and specific about how things can be changed in the DPRK. Just earlier this morning, talking about the extraordinary situation of a president of a sovereign nation actually ordering the assassination of a relative in a third country. It's truly an outlaw regime that knows no limits, apparently, to its actions. Many of us in Washington remain deeply concerned about the North Korean programs, whether it's the nuclear program, whether it's apparently this large stock of weapons of mass destruction in terms of chemical weapons now that are coming to light, and all of their weapons program and their overall behavior in the international community. Along with my colleagues at the Heritage Foundation, I've done considerable research, which we share with high-ranking government officials in Washington, on how to ensure safety and stability in a world with proliferating nuclear weapons. We find that there are two key elements to safety and stability which are absolutely crucial. The first one is a comprehensive missile defense system. I stress defense, and I stress it particularly to my friends in China, where I was just earlier last week, that THAAD is not a threat to the PRC, that it is in fact a defensive system, and we should be supportive of common defense whenever we can. It makes nations safer from attacks and therefore reduces the attraction of launching nuclear weapons. Secondly, and equally important, is the absolute strength of the relationship between a strong America and her vital allies throughout the region. Any disruption, either real or perceived, of the ties between the United States and allies like Korea can be catastrophic for the stability of the Korean Peninsula and indeed of the entire region. And we have seen U.S.-Korean relationships go up and down, but fundamentally, I think they are strong and they are enduring, and they have endured now for 2/3 of a century, and I hope they will continue forever. Underlying that, we must be united between Seoul, Washington, Tokyo, in terms of our dealings with Pyongyang. The United States, Japan, and Korea must remain committed to each other and to preserving the existing international framework which allows our mutual security and prosperity to advance. Also notable is that dealing with dictator Kim, the youngest is a challenge not only to the South Korean government, but also to Washington and to Beijing. In meetings with Beijing's political leaders, I've stressed the economic and financial dependence of the North Koreans on China, supplying more than 75% of the food stocks, 90% of the energy to North Korea. China has to be a partner in terms of explaining to North Korea what the future really holds. I believe China finally recognizes this. They have, in fact, snubbed the North Korean leadership at international meetings and have now said that they will support several of the United Nations resolutions that have already been enacted. I think this is a very good first step in terms of bringing the world community to a realization that the challenge of Korean unification is one not just for the Korean people, not just for Asia, but for people all around the world. Let me conclude with several other thoughts. There are big challenges in the future. There will be challenges with all of our friends here in Asia understanding the new administration and the direction in which it will go. There will be challenges for Americans to understand the new administration and everywhere that it perhaps will be going. But I think we can be reassured, if you will, that Asia will be an area of great and continuing interest to the administration. I already mentioned Secretary Mattis's visit to North Asia, who was the first foreign head of government for President-elect Trump to meet with just a week after his election. Prime Minister Abe met with him in New York. Who was the first foreign leader to have an extended meeting both in the White House and in the Florida White House with the president? Again, it was the leader of Japan, pointing out again not just the importance of that bilateral relationship, but the symbolism that Asia is important to the United States of America. We have seen the new Secretary of State have a very positive and productive meeting with the Foreign Minister of China. We know that President Trump and President Xi from Beijing have had a positive and constructive telephone conversation, which I'm sure will be followed up on in the future. So we are looking forward, really, to a new era where, under new means and different forms than was put forward in the recent past under the past administration, America's continued commitment to Asia will be expressed in new and, I believe, very positive ways. No, it won't be called a Trans-Pacific Partnership, but yes, I believe very strongly it will reaffirm America's commitment in security, in terms of economic relationships, and in terms of that very important people-to-people kind of diplomacy, public diplomacy, if you will, that brings people together from across borders and finds out and helps us all discover from each other what it is we share as human individuals as we look forward to new days and new years ahead. I very much look forward to the further deliberations of the conference, and I thank you for inviting me back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Edwin Feulner.